In this session, or rather lecture, we will look at the form, meter, and rhyme scheme of Sonnet 116, Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds. First, the form. Sonnet 116 follows the form of a typical Shakespearean sonnet. Though Shakespeare was not the first person to write sonnets in this particular style, he popularized the form so much so that it was eventually named after him. The Shakespearean sonnet is divided into two sections formally. The first 12 lines of the poem, which can be broken down into three quatrains. A quatrain is a stanza of 4 lines. So 3 quatrain means 12 lines. And the final two, which make up a rhyming couplet. A couplet is a stanza of 2 lines. क्वाट्रेन को हिंदी में हम चौपाई कहते हैं और कपलेट को हिंदी में हम दोहा कहते हैं. ये शब्द हिंदी वाले आपने सुने हुए होंगे. The shift between line 12 and line 13 is called the volta or turn, and this shift in the organization of the rhyme also marks a shift in its content. In the Petrarchan sonnet, now Petrarch, पहले मैंने sonnet writing पे notes दिए हैं, उसमें बताया गया था, was an ancient Latin poet, meaning Italian poet, and who was the first one to introduce sonnet writing. An older form from which the Shakespearean sonnet diverges, meaning changes direction. The volta falls between lines 8 and 9. That means that the speaker in a Petrarchan sonnet has a lot of space before the poem ends, 6 lines to be exact, to reconsider, to change their mind, to explore new possibilities. For this reason, it often feels like the speaker of a Petrarchan sonnet is having an argument with themselves. By contrast, in the Shakespearean sonnet, like we have here, the volta comes very close to the end of the poem. There isn't much space for the speaker of the poem to reconsider or to change course. For this reason, the volta of a Shakespearean sonnet often serves to confirm or summarize the rest of the poem. यानी कि उसका समावेश करती हैं वो अंत की 2 पंक्तियाँ. This is certainly the case in Sonnet 116, where the poem's final lines reaffirm, to the point of being hyperbolic, how certain the speaker is of his position. While the if that begins in line 13 could be read as the speaker granting a moment of hesitation, perhaps allowing himself space for reconsideration, this is abruptly countered in line 14. He is not arguing with himself, but rather setting himself up to hammer his point home even more emphatically. If he is wrong, then he has never written anything and no one has ever been in love. Two things that are patently not true. As such, he must not be wrong, and the poem's form itself refuses to entertain any arguments to the contrary. Meter. Like all Shakespearean sonnets, Sonnet 116 is in iambic pentameter. Indeed, it contains a number of lines that are perfectly iambic, adhering to the meter without relying on the slight substitutions that often mark iambic writing. Iambic pentameter means a line which has 5 non-stress syllables and 5 stress syllables. यानी कि 5 ध्वनियाँ ऐसी जो हल्की बोली जाती हैं और 5 ध्वनियाँ ऐसी जो ज़ोर देकर बोली जाती हैं. For example, line 7 is exceptionally smooth. It is the star to every wandering bark. Here, the regularity of the meter mimics or copies the solidity and dependability of the star itself. In its smooth, unblemished meter, the line becomes an image of love, embodying its changeless nature. Not all of the poem is quite this smooth. There are other lines where the meter is slightly more irregular. For example, lines 6 and 8 have feminine endings that looks on tempest and is never shaken, and whose worth is unknown, although his height be taken. These lines contain an extra syllable, making them each 11 syllables long. However, this extra syllable does not significantly disrupt the rhyme of the lines, the rhythm of the lines. The stresses still all fall in the correct spots, maintaining the iambic da dum rhythm. Unstressed syllable, stress syllable. These metrical substitutions and others like them contribute to the sonic richness of the poem, but they do not significantly affect its interpretation. The first two lines of the poem are more complicated and potentially more significant. They contain a number of unusual and suggestive substitutions. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments, love is not love, etc. The first line is metrically ambiguous. Different readers may place the stresses in different places. For instance, one might plausibly scan the first three words of the line as an anapest, let me not. This comes with some disadvantages. For instance, it reduces the total number of stresses in the line to 4 rather than the 5 one generally finds even in the most irregular iambic lines. However, one might plausibly doubt whether this line is iambic at all. There is only one clear iamb in the line, in the third foot, the mar. Unlike many of Shakespeare's sonnets, Sonnet 116 does not immediately establish a strong iambic rhythm and then subsequently build in variations. Instead, it starts in rhythmic chaos and then gradually rights itself, slowly building an iambic rhythm. This rhythm emerges in the first 3 feet of line 2, though it is quickly troubled again with a trochaic substitution in foot 4. Love is. It is not at all unusual to find a trochee in this position, especially following a caesura. But it is striking that the cause of its metrical variation is the word love, which the speaker argues is the thing which least causes variation and change. In other words, there is a tension between the poem's argument, its content, and its form in the opening lines of the poem. Even as the speaker asserts that love brooks no change or alteration, his lines are full of metrical changes. Now, this is a paradox. One might go so far as to describe these impediments, hiccups, that catch and perturb a careful reader. In a sense, though, this tension between form and content reinforces the speaker's point. Love does not change when it encounters difficulties or challenges, he argues. So too, his poem perseveres through its initial metrical difficulties, eventually establishing a smooth and effective iambic rhythm. The metrical disturbances of the first two lines model for the reader the conflicts and troubles that inevitably crop up in every relationship. And the poem itself models how love overcomes those difficulties. The rhyme scheme. Sonnet 116 follows the standard rhyme scheme of a Shakespearean sonnet for the most part. Though the poem is one stanza, it can be divided into three quatrains and a final couplet. The three quatrains are rhymed A B A B C D C D E F E F B B. Throughout, the speaker uses strong, perfect rhymes. In his rhyming, at least, the speaker is confident and smooth, fully capable of making his argument and making it sing. For modern readers, this may come as a surprise. A number of the poem's rhymes seem like they ought to be treated as slant rhymes, that is, love and remove in lines 2 and 4, come and doom in lines 10 and 12. For Shakespeare's early readers, however, these would have been full rhymes. In the centuries since the poem was written, English pronunciation has shifted so that the words like love and remove no longer rhyme. In the final two lines of the poem, the organization of the rhyme scheme shifts and breaks from the usual pattern of the Shakespearean sonnet. Traditionally, the final two lines of a Shakespearean sonnet are rhymed GG, introducing a new rhyme sound at the end of the poem. Sonnet 116 fails to do that, returning instead to the rhyme of lines 2 and 4, with a slight difference, loved instead of love. This return to the poem's earlier rhyme sound has several effects. First, it calls the reader's mind back to the poem's initial argument that love does not change even when faced with difficulty. Second, it reinforces that argument. Just as love does not change, so too the poem resists novelty, returning to the same rhyme sounds at critical moments. Now, a look at the speaker of the poem. Although the speaker of Sonnet 116 refers to himself several times in the poem, the reader learns almost nothing about him except that he is a person with strong ideas about love. Indeed, the reader cannot even be sure that he is the right pronoun for the speaker based on the available evidence in the poem. There is, however, a long tradition among scholars of reading Shakespeare's sonnets as a semi autobiographical text in which the reader recounts two love affairs. First, with an aristocratic young man, that is the fair youth, and later with a mysterious woman, often referred to as the Dark Lady. If one reads Sonnet 116 in the context of the full series, it becomes part of the complex, often tumultuous relationship between the speaker and the young man. In that case, the poem is not only about love, it is also part of a relationship, a proclamation that the speaker makes in order to protect his relationship with the young man. However, there is considerable controversy among scholars about whether it is appropriate to read Shakespeare's sonnets as a sequence. It remains viable to interpret Sonnet 116 outside of the context of the speaker's relationship with the young man, and instead as a passionate and grand statement about love in general. The setting of the poem. Sonnet 116 provides little information about its setting. Though a reader may assume that the sonnet in Renaissance London is set in Renaissance London, likely during the 1590s when Shakespeare wrote it, the poem itself resolutely refuses to allude to its location in time or space. Of course, there are a few clues in the poem that it belongs to an earlier historical moment. For instance, sailors no longer rely on the stars to navigate, they use GPS today. The poem refuses to specify its setting because it seeks to make a general, universal statement about love, a statement which will always be true in any setting. It presents itself stripped of settings so that anyone might encounter the poem and apply it to their own life. Now, the literary and historical context of the poem. First, the literary context. Sonnet 116 was most likely written in the 1590s during a craze for sonnets. Though poets like Thomas White began to write sonnets in English in the 1530s and 1540s, the form did not become widely popular until the 1590s after the posthumous publication of Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophil to Stella. This means that the sonnet arrived in England relatively late. By the time White began writing sonnets in the early 16th century, the form had been popular in Italy and France for several hundred years. The form thus came to English with baggage in the forms of many tropes and cliches associated with it. For instance, sonnets were usually organized in long sequences, chains of many related poems, which, in a certain light, would tell a story, usually a story of unrequited love. Almost all Renaissance sonnet sequences are narrated by a male speaker who is passionately in love with an unattainable woman, so much so that he seems on the verge of madness, out of control. Poets also often used nautical metaphors to express this state of semi madness, describing themselves as doomed ships whose captains were negligent or drunk or forgetful. This context is evident in Shakespeare's poem, though he has worked to reverse them. Instead of describing a desperate, unrequited love, Shakespeare's speaker describes a union that binds together two willing participants in a long term, stable union. And instead of an out of control ship, the speaker presents his readers in lines 5 to 8 images of safe, responsible navigation. Sonnet 116 is thus a poem that is highly self conscious about its own literary context. It relies on the reader's knowledge of that context for some of its effect. The poem is all the more moving and beautiful because it refuses a tradition of desperate, unrequited love to instead depict what stable happiness might look like. Now, the historical context. The 1590s, when Shakespeare most likely wrote Sonnet 116, were a time of relative peace and prosperity in English society. Queen Elizabeth, an imposing figure and a unifying force in the country, was at the height of her power. English forces had also recently defeated the Spanish Armada, substantially diminishing the threat of foreign invasion. Diminishing meaning reducing. In this climate, English poets turned their attention to matters of the heart. Indeed, several of Shakespeare's most celebrated texts dealing with love belong to the decade, including Romeo and Juliet and As You Like It. However, this peaceful period was short lived. In 1603, Elizabeth had died and the crown had passed to the much less popular, much more divisive James I. By the 1640s, the country had descended into civil war. A poem like Sonnet 116 is thus a document of a society in transition, descending into serious conflict, yet enjoying a final moment of peace and calm before the storm sets in. And with this, we finish with the analysis of the poem Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds, Sonnet 116 by William Shakespeare. Thank you and God bless you.